Some of the most extraordinary places ever built are ones most people have never heard of, not the famous ones. The ones sitting quietly in desert canyons and river bottomlands, holding the memory of civilizations the modern world forgot to talk about. A cliff city still intact 7 centuries after the last person left. A mound larger than any Egyptian pyramid, sitting in a suburb that has no idea what it's next to. An earthwork so precisely aligned to the moon it took generations just to design. These are real places, and tonight we go inside 16 of them. If you sleep better with something slow and genuine playing in the background, this was made for you. Like and subscribe before we begin. Let's go. Mesa Verde, Cliff Palace. There is a canyon in southwestern Colorado where the land breaks open without warning, the flat mesa top simply ending at a vertical edge and dropping away into a depth that takes a moment to fully comprehend. The canyon walls are sandstone, layered, banded, the colors shifting from cream to rust to deep ochre depending on the hour and the angle of the light. Pinyon pines and juniper trees cling to the rim and the upper slopes, their roots finding purchase in the rock with the patient determination of things that have learned to survive on very little. And in the face of one of those canyon walls, set back beneath a natural overhang of stone that curves above it like a cupped hand, there is a city. Not the ruin of a city, though ruin is what time has made of it, but a city in the full sense, a place where hundreds of people once lived and worked and raised children and conducted ceremonies and argued and celebrated and carried out the 10,000 ordinary acts that constitute a human life lived in community with others. This is Cliff Palace, and it is one of the most extraordinary places in North America. The people who built Cliff Palace are known today as the ancestral Puebloans, a name that connects them to the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest who are their direct descendants and who regard Mesa Verde as a place of profound ancestral significance. They began building in the alcove sometime around 1190 CE, and the construction continued and evolved over the following century until the site reached its greatest extent in the late 1200s. The alcove that shelters Cliff Palace is not a small feature. It is roughly 90 meters wide and 27 meters deep, its overhanging roof of sandstone providing shelter from the rain and the snow while allowing the low winter sun to reach into the interior and warm the stone. The people who chose this location understood their environment with great sophistication. The overhang that protects the site, in winter, opens to the sky at precisely the angle that allows the summer sun, higher in the sky, to be blocked, keeping the interior cool during the hottest months. This was not luck. This was knowledge accumulated across generations of careful observation of how the sun moves through the canyon system at different times of year, applied deliberately in the selection of a building site. Cliff Palace contains around 150 rooms and 23 kivas, the circular ceremonial chambers that are the architectural signature of ancestral Puebloan culture. The rooms vary in size and function, some of them storage spaces for the food and materials that sustain the community, others living quarters where families slept and cooked and sheltered from the canyon winters. The kivas were the ceremonial heart of the settlement. Semi-subterranean spaces entered through a hole in the roof, their interiors organized around a central fire pit and a sipapu, the small, symbolic opening in the floor that represented the passage between the underworld and the world above. The masonry at Cliff Palace is remarkable. The walls are built from carefully shaped sandstone blocks, their surfaces worked smooth, fitted together with a mud mortar that has survived 7 centuries of freeze and thaw cycles in the canyon with a tenacity that modern conservators deeply respect. Some of the original plaster still adheres to interior wall surfaces, and in places traces of painted decoration survive. Geometric patterns in red and white that give a glimpse of how richly decorated these spaces once were. The tower that rises at the southern end of Cliff Palace is the most visually dramatic element of the site. 4 stories tall, its circular form rising above the surrounding roofline, its function debated by researchers but its presence undeniable. It may have served as an observatory, a signal tower, a place of ceremony. Whatever its specific purpose, it anchors. The southern end of the site with an authority that the eye returns to again and again. Living at Cliff Palace required a relationship with the vertical that most people today would find challenging. Access to the alcove from the mesa top above involved climbing and descending hand and toe, holds cut directly into the canyon wall, small depressions in the rock, barely large enough for a foot, spaced at intervals that required both physical confidence and a complete familiarity with the specific route. Children grew up making these climbs as a matter of daily routine. The canyon wall was not a barrier to the people of Cliff Palace. It was a staircase. The fields where the community grew its corn and beans and squash were on the mesa top above the alcove, flat, relatively fertile ground where the thin desert soil could be coaxed into productivity with careful management of water and the patient amendment of the earth over many growing seasons. Every day the farmers of Cliffy Palace climbed from their alcove home to their mesa top fields and descended again in the evening, moving vertically through their landscape as naturally as a modern commuter moves horizontally through a city. The question of why the ancestral Puebloans moved into the cliff alcoves in the late 12th century, having previously lived in surface settlements on the mesa tops, is one that researchers have considered carefully. The cliff locations are defensible in a way that open mesa settlements are not, and there is archaeological evidence of conflict and social stress in the region during this period. But defense alone may not be the complete explanation. The alcoves also offered the practical advantages of shelter and solar orientation that any community in this high desert environment would have valued. Whatever the reasons for the move into the cliffs, the community at Cliff Palace did not stay long by the standards of the sites we have explored in these chapters. By around 1300 CE, the site was abandoned, the population dispersing southward and eastward to join other Pueblo communities in locations where water was more reliable and the social environment more stable. The abandonment was not abrupt but gradual, a slow departure rather than a sudden flight, the community unwinding itself from the alcove over a period of years. What they left behind was preserved by the dry canyon air with extraordinary fidelity. The walls still stand. The kivas still hold their circular form. The handprints of the builders are still visible in the plaster of some interior walls. The actual hands of the people who made this place, pressed into wet mud 700 years ago and held there ever since by the desert's patient, preserving dryness. Come here at dusk when the canyon light is going gold and the shadows are long across the alcove floor, and stand at the edge of the overlook and look across at Cliff Palace in that last warm light. The city in the cliff will glow, and the silence of the canyon will hold it as it has always held it, with a care and a completeness that nothing built since has managed to improve upon. Cahokia, Monk's Mound. There is a place in southwestern Illinois, just across the Mississippi River from the modern city of St. Louis, where the flat river bottomland stretches away in every direction, and the sky above it is enormous in the way that Midwestern skies are enormous, uninterrupted, pressing down close to the horizon, giving the landscape a horizontal emphasis that makes anything rising from it feel significant by contrast, and rising from it in the middle of what is now a state historic site, surrounded by suburban development and highway noise, there is a mound of earth that is larger by volume than any of the Egyptian pyramids. Not taller, not as dramatically shaped, but larger, more earth moved, more human labor invested in its creation, more sheer accumulated effort contained within its broad terraced form than in almost any other human-made structure on the North American continent. This is Monk's Mound, and the civilization that built it, the Mississippian culture centered on the city archaeologists call Cahokia, is one of the most remarkable and least discussed chapters in the entire human story. Cahokia was, at its peak around 1100 CE, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Its population at that time is estimated at somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, a number that made it larger than contemporary London, larger than any city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 18th century. It covered an area of roughly 13 square kilometers, contained over 100 earthen mounds of various sizes and functions, and sat at the center of a trade network that extended across much of the North American continent. Monk's Mound is the centerpiece of this lost city. It rises in 4 terraces to a height of around 30 meters, its base covering an area of roughly 8 hectares, 14 hectares, if you include the associated plaza. The construction of this mound required the movement of an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried basket by human hands over a period of construction that spanned several centuries. There was a large building on the summit of Monk's Mound, the residence or ceremonial space of the paramount chief, elevated above the city on its artificial mountain of earth, visible from enormous distances across the flat river plain. To look up at that summit from the grand plaza below was to understand immediately and physically the distance between the ruler and the ruled. The city that surrounded Monk's Mound was carefully planned. The grand plaza in front of the mound was a deliberately leveled open space, scraped flat and maintained clear of vegetation, used for ceremonies and gatherings that brought the population of the city together in the shadow of the great mound. Around the central precinct, a wooden palisade wall enclosed the most sacred and politically significant structures, marking a boundary between the elite ceremonial core of the city and the residential neighborhoods that spread outward in every direction. Those neighborhoods were dense and organized, rows of thatched roof houses arranged around smaller plazas, each neighborhood perhaps representing a distinct kin, group, or community within the larger urban whole. The people who lived in them were farmers, craftspeople, traders, specialists in the production of the shell beads and copper ornaments and ceramic vessels that moved through the Cahokian trade network across hundreds of kilometers. Among the most remarkable discoveries at Cahokia is a series of large circular arrangements of wooden posts, structures that archaeologists have named Woodhenge. These post circles were solar observatories, their posts aligned to mark the positions of sunrise at the solstices and equinoxes, allowing the Cahokian priests or astronomers to track the movement of the sun through the year with precision. The ability to predict the solstices and equinoxes was not merely practical, it was the foundation of the ceremonial calendar that organized the ritual life of the city and the agricultural cycle that sustained it. Cahokia declined as dramatically as it had risen. By around 1300 CE, the city was largely abandoned, its population dispersed, its great mounds left without the maintenance that had kept them sharp-edged and purposeful. The reasons for the collapse are debated: flooding, environmental degradation, political instability, the failure of the agricultural system that had sustained such a large urban population in a river bottomland environment. Perhaps all of these together. The compounding pressures of a civilization that had pushed its environment and its social organization to their limits simultaneously. What remains is the mounds, reduced by centuries of erosion and, in many cases, by deliberate leveling for agriculture and development, but still present, still rising from the Illinois. Plain with enough presence to convey something of what this place once was. Monk's Mound itself is intact, its broad terraces still clearly defined, its summit still commanding that enormous Midwestern sky. Stand at its base and look up and feel the scale of it. Not the dramatic vertical scale of a pyramid or a cliff, but the horizontal, accumulated, patient scale of a mountain made by hand, basket by basket, generation by generation, in the middle of the American plain. It is one of the great human achievements of the ancient world, and almost nobody knows it exists. Montezuma Castle. There is a limestone cliff in the Verde Valley of central Arizona, rising above a grove of sycamore trees whose pale trunks catch the light in the early morning with a quality that seems almost deliberate, almost arranged, as though the landscape had positioned them there specifically to frame what sits in the cliff face above them. The valley floor is green along the creek, which is called Beaver Creek, and the water moves through it quietly in all seasons. Reliable and cool in a landscape where reliable and cool water is among the most precious things the earth can offer. And in the face of that limestone cliff, 20 meters above the valley floor, tucked into a natural alcove with the same instinct for shelter and elevation that we have seen in other cliff-dwelling cultures. There is a 5-story structure of stone and mortar that has been standing in this alcove for over 600 years. It is called Montezuma Castle, a name given to it by European settlers who assumed incorrectly that it had some connection to the Aztec emperor. It has no such connection. It was built and occupied by the Senegua people, a culture of the American Southwest whose name means without water in Spanish, a reference to the dry ponderosa pine forests of the region where their culture first developed. The Senegua who built Montezuma Castle arrived in the Verde Valley sometime around 1100 CE. Drawn by what the surrounding plateau country could not offer, permanent water, a milder climate, a longer growing season made possible by the lower elevation of the valley floor. They found in this limestone canyon country a landscape that rewarded the particular skills they had developed over generations of careful resource management. And they settled here with an intention that the architecture they left behind makes entirely clear. Montezuma Castle contains around 20 rooms spread across its 5 stories. The structure built directly into and against the back wall of the alcove, its builders using the natural cave as the rear wall and roof of the uppermost levels and constructing the lower stories as freestanding masonry that steps forward from the cliff face. The construction is of limestone blocks and clay mortar, the walls smooth plastered on their interior surfaces. The whole structure fitted into its alcove with a precision that makes the building and the cliff feel like a single unified thing, rather than a human insertion into a natural space. Access to the castle was, as at Cliff Palace in Colorado, entirely vertical. There were no stairs cut into the cliff face. Entry was by ladder, the ladders pulled up after the inhabitants had climbed to their level, the act of withdrawal transforming the cliff face into a smooth and unclimbable surface that offered no purchase to anyone not invited inside. 20 meters of vertical limestone with a smooth face is a more effective barrier than almost any wall a community could have. Built on flat ground, the rooms within Montezuma Castle are small by modern standards, low-ceilinged, intimate, the walls close enough to touch on both sides simultaneously in the narrower spaces, but they were not cramped in the way that modern sensibility might expect. They were scaled to the lives that were lived in them, to sleeping and storage and the preparation of food, to the keeping of the tools and materials and personal objects that constituted a family's portable world. The communal life of the settlement happened on the ledge in front of the structure, in the shared spaces where people gathered and worked and socialized in the open air of the alcove. The valley spread below them and the sky above the cliff, rim present but framed, contained, given a human scale by the stone walls of the castle around them. The Senegua, who lived at Montezuma Castle, were not isolated. The Verde Valley in the 12th and 13th centuries was a connected place, its communities, participating in trade networks that brought shell from the Pacific coast, copper bells from workshops far to the south, cotton textiles and ceramic vessels from neighboring cultures whose territories bordered the Senegua homeland. The castle was not a retreat from the world. It was a home base within a world that extended well beyond the valley, a place you returned to from trading journeys and seasonal movements and the various forms of engagement with the wider southwestern world. The creek below the castle supported agriculture. The Senegua farmed the valley floor, growing corn and beans and squash in fields watered by the reliable flow of Beaver Creek and by the irrigation channels they dug to extend that water across a wider area of cultivable ground. The proximity of the fields to the castle, with its elevated vantage point over the valley floor, gave the community a natural watch position over their agricultural investment. The people in the upper stories could see across a considerable stretch of valley from their ledge, could monitor the condition of the fields and the approach of anyone moving through the landscape below. Montezuma Castle was abandoned around 1425 CE, part of a broader pattern of Senegua withdrawal from the Verde Valley that archaeologists attribute to a combination of factors: drought, resource depletion, the complex social and political pressures of a region where multiple cultures were competing for the same limited productive land. The departure was gradual, as abandonments in this region tend to be. Not a sudden flight, but a slow unwinding, families and groups leaving over a period of years until the castle was empty and the ladders were gone and the alcove fell quiet. The dry Arizona air preserved what was left with extraordinary fidelity. Original roof beams are still in place in some sections of the structure. Actual wood, cut and shaped by Sinagua, hands 6 centuries ago, still bearing the marks of the tools that worked it, still supporting the weight of the masonry above with a quiet structural integrity that the desert climate has allowed to persist long past any reasonable expectation of survival. There is a particular quality to standing below Montezuma Castle and looking up at it, the way the structure sits in its alcove with such complete self-assurance, the way the cliff holds it and the sycamores below frame it, and the creek sounds in the background with its constant reliable note. It does not look abandoned, it looks inhabited by something, by the memory of the people who built it and the 6 centuries of desert silence that have settled into it since they left. The Verde Valley is warm in the afternoon. The limestone catches the light and holds it. And 20 meters above the creek, in its alcove in the cliff, Montezuma Castle keeps its long and patient watch over the valley below, exactly as it has always done. Bandelier National Monument. There is a canyon in the Jemez Mountains of northern New Mexico where the land has been shaped by two of the most powerful forces that geology possesses: volcanic eruption and the slow, patient work of water cutting through soft stone over hundreds of thousands of years. The result is a landscape of extraordinary character. Canyon walls of pale volcanic tuff, a rock so soft that it can be worked with wooden tools, rising above a canyon floor where the Rio de los Frijoles runs clear and cold through a ribbon of cottonwood and ponderosa pine that stands in vivid contrast to the dry mesa country above. This is Frijoles Canyon, the heart of what is now Bandelier National Monument, and carved into those soft canyon walls, and built against them, and layered across the canyon floor in the remains of structures that the earth has been slowly reclaiming for 6 centuries, there is one of the most complete and most quietly affecting records of ancestral Puebloan life anywhere in the American Southwest. The people who made their home in Frijoles Canyon arrived here sometime around 1150 CE, drawn by the combination of reliable water, arable land on the canyon floor, and the extraordinary building material that the volcanic tuff walls offered. The tuff, formed from compressed volcanic ash deposited by the massive eruption of the Valles caldera to the northwest roughly 1.2 million years ago, is soft enough when freshly exposed to be carved with stone tools, hardening gradually as it dries and weathers. The ancestral Puebloans recognized immediately what this material made possible, and they used it with a thoroughness and an ingenuity that still astonishes visitors to the canyon today. The most visible expression of that ingenuity is the cavates, the rooms carved directly into the canyon wall, hollowed out of the living rock to create sleeping and storage spaces that required no construction of walls or roofs because the rock itself provided all four surfaces. The cavates were not freestanding dwellings. They were the rear portions of multi-story pueblo structures built against the cliff face, the carved rooms serving as the innermost spaces of a larger complex whose outer walls were constructed from blocks of the same tuff, cut from the cliff and stacked with mud mortar into rooms that stepped outward from the canyon wall in terraced rows. The main pueblo ruin on the canyon floor, known as Tiwani, is a circular structure whose plan is so geometrically deliberate that it reads even in its ruined state as an architectural statement of considerable sophistication. The circular form encloses a central plaza, the rooms arranged around its perimeter in a continuous ring, broken only by a single, narrow, entrance passageway. At its greatest extent, Taiwan contained around 400 rooms, its walls rising to 3 stories in some sections, housing a community of several hundred people who lived within its circular embrace and conducted their ceremonial life in the kivas sunk into the plaza floor. The relationship between Tiwonyi on the canyon floor and the Cavate dwellings in the cliff above it is one of the most interesting spatial arrangements in ancestral Puebloan architecture. The two elements of the settlement, the freestanding pueblo and the cliff rooms, were not separate communities, but parts of a single integrated whole, connected by the daily movement of people up and down the canyon wall between the lower and upper portions of their world. Some researchers believe the cliff rooms were used primarily for sleeping and storage, with the communal and ceremonial life of the settlement centered on Tiwonyi and its plaza below. Others suggest the arrangement reflects a more complex social organization, with different portions of the community occupying different vertical zones of the canyon for reasons that were as much social and ritual as practical. Walking the cliff. Base trail at Bandelier today. You pass the cavate openings at eye level and above, some of them accessible by the wooden ladders that the Park Service has installed to allow visitors to climb into the carved chambers and experience their interior firsthand. The experience of entering a cavate is immediately and powerfully intimate. The walls are curved and smooth where the tuff has been worked, and in many of the chambers the smoke blackening of ancient fires is still visible on the ceiling. The actual carbon of fires that burned here 5 and 6 centuries ago, preserved in the dry rock of the canyon wall with a fidelity that makes the distance of time feel suddenly very small. In some cavates, the original plaster still adheres to the walls in patches, and traces of painted decoration are visible, the same geometric tradition found across ancestral Puebloan sites, rendered here on the curved walls of a carved rock chamber in pigments that the canyon's sheltered dryness has preserved past any reasonable expectation. Handprints appear here and there, pressed into wet plaster by the people who smoothed these walls and left in the doing of it the most direct and most human mark that any ancient site can offer. The shape of a specific hand belonging to a specific person who stood in this specific place and reached out and touched the wall. The canyon supported a large and apparently thriving community for roughly 4 centuries. The population of Frijoles Canyon and the surrounding Mesa country reaching its peak sometime in the early to mid 1400s, before the familiar pattern of southwestern abandonment began to assert itself. By around 1550 CE, the canyon was largely empty, the population having moved eastward to the Rio Grande Valley, where the pueblos of their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples, who consider Bandelier ancestral territory, still stand and are still occupied today. The connection between Bandelier and the living Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande is not abstract or historical. It is direct and personal and actively maintained. The Cochiti, Santa Clara, San Ildefonso, and other Pueblo peoples regard Frijoles Canyon as the home of their ancestors, visit it for ceremonial purposes, and participate in the ongoing interpretation and management of the site in ways that ensure the canyon is understood not as a dead ruin but as a living part of a continuing cultural tradition. To come to Bandelier in the early morning before the canyon fills with the warmth of the New Mexico day. When the cottonwoods along the creek are catching the first light and the canyon walls are still in shadow and the cavite openings are dark mouths in the pale cliff face above the trail. The creek runs over its stones with the same sound it has always made. The tough walls hold their carved chambers in their soft rock embrace. And somewhere in the quiet of the canyon, in the smoke-blackened ceilings and the faded handprints and the circular ruin of Tiwonyi on the valley floor, the people who lived here are still entirely present. Canyon de Chelly. There is a canyon system in the northeastern corner of Arizona on the Navajo Nation, where the red sandstone walls rise so dramatically from the canyon floor that the first sight of them stops you completely. Not gradually, not with a slow accumulation of impression, but all at once, the way genuinely extraordinary things tend to announce themselves. The rock is the color of dried blood in some lights and the color of fire in others, and it rises in sheer vertical faces that in places reach nearly 300 meters from the canyon floor to the rim above. The canyon is called Canyon de Chelly. The name comes from a Spanish approximation of the Navajo word Chelly, which means rock canyon, and it is one of those place names that feels entirely inadequate to what it describes. The way that any name eventually feels inadequate to a place that has been holding human life within its walls for nearly 5,000 years. Because that is the extraordinary fact. About Canyon de Chelly, people have been living here, continuously or near continuously, longer than almost anywhere else in North America. The canyon has sheltered human communities from the earliest basket maker people through the ancestral Puebloans and into the present day, where Navajo families still farm the canyon floor and tend their orchards and their sheep in the shadow of those same red walls that have sheltered every generation before them. The ancestral Puebloan presence in the canyon is the most architecturally visible of its ancient layers. Between roughly 350 and 1300 CE, the canyon was intensively occupied by communities who built their homes and ceremonial spaces in the alcoves of the canyon walls, using the same instinct for elevated shelter that drove cliff-dwelling peoples across the southwest to seek out the natural overhangs and recesses that the geology of the region offers in such abundance. The most celebrated of these cliff dwellings is the White House ruin, named for the long white plaster wall that marks its upper section and that stands out against the red sandstone of the canyon wall with a clarity that makes it visible from the canyon rim nearly 100 meters above. The White House is a two-part structure, a lower section built on the canyon floor and an upper section tucked into an alcove in the cliff above. The two portions originally connected by ladders that allowed the inhabitants to move between them. The white plaster of the upper section has survived centuries of canyon weather with a preservation that the dry alcove environment has made possible, and it glows against the red rock in the afternoon light with a quality that photographers and painters have been trying to capture accurately for well over a century. But the White House is only the most visited of the canyon's ancient structures. Throughout the canyon system, which includes the main Canyon de Chelly and its tributary Canyon del Muerto, there are hundreds of archaeological sites, many of them unexcavated, many accessible only to Navajo guides who know the canyon intimately and who carry within their knowledge of the landscape a continuity of relationship with this place that goes back generations. Canyon del Muerto, the Canyon of the Dead, named for the human remains found there by early researchers, contains some of the most significant prehistoric art in the American Southwest. The canyon walls throughout the system are covered in pictographs and petroglyphs left by successive cultures across thousands of years. The earliest simple geometric forms pressed into the rock surface, the later images more complex and figurative, depicting humans and animals, and the ceremonial imagery of cultures whose specific beliefs we can only partially reconstruct from the visual evidence they left behind. The Antelope House ruin in Canyon del Muerto takes its name from the painted antelopes on the canyon wall nearby. Large, graceful figures rendered in white pigment by a Navajo artist whose work overlies and incorporates the older ancestral Pueblo imagery below it in a layering that makes the canyon wall itself a document of continuous human presence, each culture adding its voice to the conversation that the rock face has been holding across the centuries. The Navajo relationship with Canyon de Chelly is not historical in the sense of belonging to the past. The canyon is home. Navajo families have been farming the canyon floor since the 17th century, and some of those families maintain that presence today, tending peach orchards planted centuries ago, grazing sheep on the canyon grasslands, living in hogans on the valley floor, in the shadow of the red walls that their ancestors chose for the same reasons that every culture before them chose this place. The water is reliable. The walls provide shelter from the wind. The soil of the canyon floor is deep and fertile, enriched by the sediment that the seasonal floods deposit with the same generosity they always have. Canyon de Chelly is unique among major archaeological sites in the American Southwest in that it is not a place where the indigenous connection has been severed and replaced by the institutional management of a national park. The canyon is Navajo land, administered jointly by the Navajo Nation and the National Park Service. and the living community within it is not a historical footnote, but an active presence whose relationship with the landscape is ongoing and primary. To visit Canyon de Chelly is to visit a place where the ancient and the living exist not in sequence, but simultaneously, where the ruins in the cliff alcoves and the hogans on the valley floor are both expressions of the same long human attachment to the same red walled canyon. The light in Canyon de Chelly changes everything. In the early morning, when the sun has not yet reached the canyon floor and the walls above are already catching the first direct light of the day, the red sandstone glows with an intensity that seems almost internal, as though the rock were lit from within rather than illuminated from without. The cottonwood trees along the canyon floor, bare in winter and brilliant gold in autumn, add their own seasonal color to the permanent drama of the walls. In the late afternoon, when the shadows are rising from the canyon floor and the upper walls are still in full sun, the color shifts toward a deeper, warmer red, and the white plaster of the cliff dwellings catches the last horizontal light and holds it a moment longer than the surrounding rock. The canyon is always beautiful, but it is most beautiful at the edges of the day, when the light is doing something complicated with the geology and the ancient walls are glowing in their alcoves, and the sound of the wind through the cottonwoods is the only thing breaking the silence of a place that has held human life within its walls for longer than almost anywhere else on earth. Casa Grande Ruins, the Great House. There is a place in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona where the land is flat and pale and stretches away in every direction, with a particular openness of desert that has not been interrupted by mountains or dramatic geology, just an immense horizontal plain of creosote and saguaro cactus under a sky that in summer is the hard bleached blue of something that has been in the sun too long. The heat here is serious. The silence is serious. And rising from this flat and serious landscape, surrounded by the low adobe walls of the compound that once enclosed it, there is a structure that should not, by any reasonable reckoning, still be standing. It is 4 stories tall. It was built without metal tools, without the wheel, without any of the engineering technologies that modern construction takes entirely for granted. It was constructed from a material, caliche, the calcium carbonate rich soil of the Sonoran Desert that hardens when wet, and compressed, but that the rain, if given the opportunity, will eventually dissolve back into the earth from which it came. It has been standing in this desert for roughly 700 years, and nobody's entirely certain what it was for. This is Casa Grande, the Great House, and it is one of the most genuinely mysterious structures in all of North America. The Hohokam people built Casa Grande sometime around 1350 CE, during the final flourishing of a culture that had been developing in the Sonoran Desert for over 1,000 years. The Hohokam, whose name comes from the Odom language and means those who have gone, or the ancient ones, were desert farmers of extraordinary skill and ambition, the engineers of one of the most extensive irrigation canal systems built anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their canal network in the Salt and Gila River valleys covered over 1,000 kilometers of constructed waterways, moving water from the rivers across the desert floor to fields where corn, beans, squash, and cotton grew in the apparent impossibility of that arid landscape. This was not simple irrigation. It was a sophisticated hydraulic engineering project, its canals carefully graded to maintain the precise flow rates that prevented both the stagnation that silts a canal and the excess velocity that erodes it. Managing a system of this complexity required institutional knowledge, central coordination, and a community organized around the shared project of making water do what they needed it to do. Casa Grande was built at the center of one of the largest Hohokam settlements in the region, a community of perhaps 2,000 people living in a complex of compounds spread across the desert floor. The great house stood within the largest and most elaborately enclosed of these compounds, its 4 stories rising above the surrounding single-story structures, with an authority that would have been visible from a considerable distance across the flat desert landscape. The construction of Casa Grande involved the movement of an enormous quantity of caliche. Estimates suggest that the walls contain around 3,000 tons of the material, hand mixed with water and packed into forms that allowed it to cure in the desert air into a substance with a compressive strength that has outlasted the expectations of every researcher who has studied it. The walls at the base of the structure are nearly 1.25 meters thick, tapering slightly as they rise through the 4 stories. The whole mass of the building stabilized by that immense base and by the quality of the caliche itself, which when properly prepared and cured achieves a hardness approaching that of soft sandstone. The interior of the great house is divided into rooms by walls of the same caliche construction. The rooms small and dark, their ceilings supported by wooden beams that the Hohokam transported from forests in the mountains to the north, ponderosa pine, and other conifers that do not grow in the Sonoran Desert, and that had to be carried or dragged across many kilometers of desert terrain to reach the construction site. Some of these original beams are still in place, their wood preserved by the desert dryness across 7 centuries, the tool marks of their shaping still visible on their surfaces. The openings in the walls of Casa Grande, the windows and doorways and circular holes that punctuate its upper stories, have been studied for possible astronomical alignments, and several have been found. A circular hole in the upper east wall is aligned to admit the light of the setting sun at the summer solstice. Other openings align with the rising or setting of the sun or moon at significant points in the astronomical calendar. Whether Casa Grande was primarily an observatory, a ceremonial center, an elite residence, or some combination of all of these remains a question that the building itself has not yet fully answered. The compound walls that surround the great house are themselves a remarkable feature of the site. These low caliche walls enclose an area of roughly half a hectare, their construction requiring a level of organized labor and material investment that speaks of a community capable of sustained collective effort beyond the demands of daily survival. Within the compound, smaller structures and features suggest a variety of activities: storage, food preparation, ceremonial functions. The great house dominated this enclosed world from its central position, its 4 story mass giving it a presence within the compound that the surrounding structures could not approach. The Hohokam abandoned Casa Grande and the surrounding settlement sometime around 1450 CE as part of the broader collapse of Hohokam culture in the region. The reasons for this collapse are debated: prolonged drought, flooding events that damaged the canal infrastructure, social and political pressures, possibly all of these together. The O'odham people of southern Arizona today are the likely descendants of the Hohokam, and they maintain a cultural connection to Casa Grande that gives the site a living significance beyond its archaeological importance. The federal government recognized the significance of Casa Grande early. It became the first prehistoric and cultural site to be set aside for protection by the United States government in 1892, and a large metal roof was erected over the structure in 1932 to protect it from the desert rain that is its most persistent enemy. That roof, functional and entirely without aesthetic pretension, has been protecting the great house ever since, and whatever it costs in visual elegance, it more than repays in the preservation it has provided. Come here in the early morning, before the Sonoran Desert heat has established itself and the air still carries the cool clarity of the desert night. The great house stands in its compound in that morning light, its caliche walls the color of the desert floor from which they were made, its 4 stories rising against the Arizona sky with the same quiet authority they have carried for 700 years. The desert is silent around it. The creosote smells clean in the cool air. And the great house keeps its mysteries in the patient way that old things keep their mysteries. Not hidden exactly, but held, waiting for whoever comes with enough stillness and enough time to begin to understand. Moundville Archaeological Park. There is a bend in the Black Warrior River in west central Alabama, where the land flattens into a broad terrace above the river floodplain, and the soil is deep and dark and generous in the way that bottomland soil near a reliable river tends to be generous, patient, accumulated, built up over thousands of years of seasonal flooding into something that rewards cultivation with a consistency that drier and thinner soils cannot match. The river moves slowly here. The trees along its banks are large and old, and on that broad terrace above the water, arranged across an area of roughly 1.5 square kilometers, with a deliberateness that becomes more apparent the longer you spend with the site, there are 29 earthen mounds that were built by one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian North America. This is Moundville, at its peak sometime around 1200 to 1450 CE. It was the second largest city of the Mississippian culture, second only to Cahokia, in the scale of its construction and the complexity of its social organization, and in some respects, more completely preserved and more fully understood than its larger northern counterpart. The people who built it created here, on the banks of the Black Warrior River, a ceremonial and political center whose influence extended across a wide region of what is now the American Southeast, and whose artistic tradition produced some of the most remarkable objects in the entire prehistoric art of North America. The mounds at Moundville are not all the same. They vary in size, in height, in the nature of the structures that once stood on their summits, and in their position within the carefully planned layout of the site. The largest Mound B rises to a height of nearly 18 meters and covers an area at its base that makes it one of the largest platform mounds in the entire Mississippian world. Its flat summit would have supported a large structure, the residence or ceremonial space of the paramount chief, elevated above the surrounding community in the same tradition of vertical authority that we have seen at Cahokia and at other Mississippian centers. The mounds are arranged in a roughly rectangular pattern around a large central plaza, their flat summits forming a kind of elevated perimeter around the open gathering space at the heart of the site. This arrangement was not accidental. The spatial organization of Moundville reflects a cosmological vision in which the center is sacred and the periphery is structured, in which the mounds mark the boundary between the ordinary world of daily life and the elevated ceremonial world of the elite and the divine. The central plaza itself is enormous, large enough to have accommodated the entire population of the site for major ceremonial gatherings. The flat open ground providing the stage on which the public rituals of Mississippian religious and political life were performed. Ball games, ceremonies, the public display of elite authority, all of these would have taken place in this plaza, under the watchful presence of the mounds and the structures on their summits. The artistic tradition of Moundville is one of the great achievements of North American prehistoric culture, and it deserves to be far better known than it is. The objects recovered from the site, shell gorgets, ceramic vessels, copper plates, stone pallets, effigy pipes, are among the finest examples of Mississippian art anywhere, their surfaces decorated with a visual vocabulary of extraordinary sophistication that researchers have spent decades working to decode. The imagery is dense and layered, interlocking serpents and raptor birds, human figures in ceremonial dress, hands with eyes in their palms, skulls and bones, and the symbols of a mortuary ceremonialism that was central to Mississippian religious life. This visual tradition, which researchers call the Southeastern Ceremonial, a complex connected Moundville to a network of elite exchange and shared religious ideology that extended across much of the eastern half of the continent, linking communities that never met in person through the circulation of objects and images that carried shared meanings across enormous distances. The ceramic tradition of Moundville is particularly remarkable. The potters working here in the 14th and 15th centuries produced vessels of technical excellence, thin-walled, finely tempered, fired to a hardness and a consistency that speaks of craft knowledge developed and refined over many generations, whose surfaces they decorated with the same complex imagery found on the shell and copper objects, rendered in the linear precision of incised and engraved line work that the dark Moundville pottery is particularly well suited to display. The society that produced this art was organized around a hierarchy of considerable complexity. At its apex was the paramount chief, whose residence on the summit of the largest mound gave physical expression to his elevation above the rest of the community. Below him were ranked lineages of varying degrees of nobility, their relative status expressed in the location and scale of their mounds, the richness of their burials, and their access to the exotic materials, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, ceremonial objects from distant centers of production that circulated through the elite exchange networks of the Mississippian world. The burials at Moundville tell the story of this hierarchy in direct and material terms. Elite burials contain objects of exceptional rarity and craftsmanship. The shell, gorgets, and copper plates and finely made ceramic vessels that speak of access to the best materials and the best craftspeople. Commoner burials are simpler, their grave goods modest, the material expression of a life lived at the base of a social pyramid whose upper reaches were as distant from their daily experience as the summit of Mound B was from the floor of the plaza below. Moundville declined over the 15th century, its population dispersing as the political and environmental conditions that had made such a large urban concentration possible shifted and changed. By around 1500 CE, the site was no longer a major population center, though it continued to be used for ceremonial purposes by the communities that had dispersed from it. A sacred landscape that retained its significance, even after the city that had made it significant was gone. The descendants of the Moundville people are the Muskogee Creek and other southeastern tribes whose traditions and ceremonial practices carry forward, in transformed but continuous form, the cultural inheritance of the Mississippian world. The connection between Moundville and those living communities gives the site a significance that extends beyond archaeology into the living present, a reminder that the mounds on the Black Warrior River are not simply the remains of a vanished civilization, but the ancestral home of people who are still here. Come to Moundville in the late afternoon when the Alabama light is golden and low, and the shadows of the mounds stretch long across the plaza grass, and the river is visible through the trees at the edge of the terrace. The site is quiet at that hour. The mounds are large and patient in that golden light, and the Black Warrior River moves on below, as it always has, carrying the water of the Alabama hills to the sea in the same slow and deliberate way it was carrying it when the first stones of the first mound were placed on the terrace above its bank. Taos Pueblo. There is a village in northern New Mexico, at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the land rises from the high desert plateau into the forested slopes and eventually the bare rocky summits of the southern Rocky Mountains, that has been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years. Not abandoned and reoccupied, not used seasonally and then emptied, continuously inhabited. People living in the same buildings, drawing water from the same mountain stream, conducting the same ceremonial calendar, in the same places, under the same mountain sky, for more than a millennium without interruption. This is Taos Pueblo, and that fact of continuous habitation, the unbroken thread of human presence in a single place across more than 1,000 years, is the most extraordinary thing about it, more extraordinary even than the architecture, which is itself extraordinary enough to have earned the Pueblo a place on the UNESCO World Heritage List and the designation of a National Historic Landmark. The mountains behind Taos Pueblo are called the Sangre de Cristo, the blood of Christ, a name given by Spanish settlers who saw their summits turn red in the light of certain sunsets and reached for the most sacred language available to them to describe what they were seeing. The Taos people have their own name for the sacred mountain that rises behind the Pueblo, and they regard it with a reverence that goes far deeper than any name. Blue Lake, high in the mountains above the Pueblo, is the most sacred place in the Taos spiritual geography, the origin point of the people and the destination of the dead, a body of water so significant that the Taos people fought for decades through the American legal system to have it returned to their stewardship after it was incorporated into a national forest in the early 20th century. They won that fight in 1970, and the lake is theirs again. The Pueblo itself consists of two large multi-story structures, North House and South House, facing each other across the Rio Pueblo de Taos, the small, clear mountain stream that flows directly through the heart of the village from its source in the mountains above. The stream is the life of the pueblo. Its water is used for drinking and cooking and the irrigation of the fields where the community grows its traditional crops. No plumbing has been installed in the historic core of the pueblo. The residents who live in the ancient buildings still carry their water from the stream, as their ancestors have always done, maintaining a relationship with that mountain water that is both practical and profoundly ceremonial. North House is the larger of the two great structures, rising to 5 stories at its tallest section. Its adobe walls the color of the earth from which they were made, a warm reddish tan that shifts toward gold in the afternoon sun and toward a deeper brown in the cool shade of the morning. The building is a single interconnected structure of many rooms, its stories stepping back from the lowest level to the highest in the characteristic Pueblo terraced form that gives these buildings their distinctive silhouette against the mountain sky. The upper stories are accessed by ladders from the terraces below, the ladders pulled up when privacy or security is desired. The architecture of access unchanged in its fundamental logic from what it was 1,000 years ago. The walls of Taos Pueblo are built from adobe, a mixture of local soil, water, and organic material such as straw or grass, formed into bricks and dried in the sun, then laid in courses with additional adobe mortar and finished with a plaster coat that must be renewed regularly to protect the underlying brick from the rain. Adobe construction is a living process. The buildings are not finished objects that simply endure. They require constant attention, regular replastering, the ongoing investment of the community's labor to maintain the walls against the weathering that the New Mexico climate imposes. This necessity of maintenance is itself a form of relationship between the people and their buildings. The annual replastering of the Pueblo walls is not merely maintenance, it is a ceremonial act, a renewal of the community's connection to its home, performed collectively in a tradition that binds the generations together through shared physical work on the same surfaces that all the generations before them have touched and smoothed and renewed. The walls of Taos Pueblo carry within their fabric the labor of every generation that has lived here, accumulated in the adobe that has been applied and worn away and applied again across 10 centuries of continuous occupation. The adobe also carries the color of the local earth in an immediate and literal way. The soil of the Taos Valley is that particular warm reddish tan, and the walls of the pueblo are the same color because they are made from the same material. The buildings are not imposed on the landscape, they emerge from it, sharing its palette, shaped from its substance, returning to it gradually at their bases where the earth and the wall meet, and the boundary between them blurs. The ceremonial life of Taos Pueblo is rich and continuous and largely private. The Pueblo maintains a traditional religious calendar of dances and ceremonies that mark the turning of the year, the planting and harvesting of crops, the significant transitions of the community's collective life. Some of these ceremonies are open to respectful outside visitors. Many are not. And the community's maintenance of that privacy, its insistence on the right to conduct its sacred life without the observation of outsiders, is itself a form of cultural sovereignty, a refusal to allow the most intimate and significant aspects of Tao's life to become spectacle. What visitors do see is enough. The architecture alone, those great terraced walls risings, against the mountain backdrop, the stream running between the two house blocks, the adobe church of San Geronimo standing at the edge of the plaza, is an experience of rare completeness, a place where the built environment and the natural landscape have achieved a relationship of such long duration and such mutual adjustment that they seem made for each other in the most fundamental sense. The kivas of Taos Pueblo are not open to visitors. They are the ceremonial heart of the community, and their interiors belong to the people of the pueblo. But their presence is felt throughout the village, the circular forms emerging from the earth of the plaza, their ladders projecting above the roofline, Their function as the axis around which the community's spiritual life turns, giving the whole place a quality of orientation, of centeredness, that you feel even without being able to name its source. Taos Pueblo has survived everything that history has sent against it. Spanish. Colonization. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which the Taos people played a central role, the subsequent reconquest, American territorial expansion, the pressures of the modern world pressing in from every side. It has survived not by remaining unchanged. Nothing survives 1,000 years by remaining unchanged, but by maintaining the essential continuity of its communal life, while adapting the specific forms of that life to the conditions of each successive era. The mountain is still there behind the pueblo, its summit touching clouds that form and dissolve above the Sangre de Cristo in the afternoon thunderstorm season, its sacred lake still cold and clear in the high alpine basin where the Taos people have always understood their deepest origin to reside. The stream still runs between the house blocks. The walls still rise in their terraced form against the mountain sky. And the people of Taos Pueblo are still here, in the same place their ancestors chose more than 1,000 years ago, living the same continuous life that the mountains and the water and the adobe earth of this high New Mexico valley have always sustained. Come here in the early morning when the mist is still in the valley and the mountains are just beginning to catch the first light and the pueblo is quiet and the stream is audible in the silence between the house blocks. There is nowhere else in North America quite like this. There is very little anywhere in the world quite like this. A living community in a living building that has been home to the same people for more than 1,000 years, still drawing its water from the mountain, still renewing its walls with the earth of its valley, still entirely and completely itself. Blithe intaglios. There is a stretch of desert in the far eastern reaches of Riverside County in California, where the Colorado River has deposited over millennia a broad, flat terrace of gravel and pale desert pavement that stretches away from the river's edge toward the low desert mountains in a near perfect horizontal plane. The vegetation here is sparse even by desert standards. A few creosote bushes, some scattered brittle bush, the occasional cholla cactus managing its particular armed existence in the gravel. The sky above this terrace is enormous and unmediated, the kind of sky that exists only over truly flat and open ground, and the silence is the deep, pressurized silence of the Mojave and Sonoran desert borderlands where the heat in summer is a physical presence and the light flattens everything it touches into a kind of two-dimensional intensity. From the ground, this terrace looks like what it is, a flat expanse of desert gravel, unremarkable, offering nothing to the eye that would cause it to pause. But from the air, or from the low hills at the terrace edge, something becomes visible that the ground level perspective entirely conceals. Enormous figures etched into the desert pavement by the removal of the darker surface, gravel, to reveal the lighter soil beneath, extend across the terrace in forms that are immediately and unmistakably human and animal. A giant human figure here, an animal figure there, a spiral, a series of lines, each one so large that standing inside one you would have no sense of its shape or its edges, no way to read the image of which you are a part. These are the blithe intaglios, and they are among the most mysterious and most quietly astonishing ancient monuments in North America. The figures were created by scraping away the dark desert varnish, the oxidized layer of iron and manganese that coats the surface gravel of old desert pavements and gives them their characteristic dark color, to expose the lighter, yellowish, tan gravel and soil beneath. This technique, the inverse of the additive technique used in most other forms of ancient art, requires no tools beyond what the human hand and foot can manage. The gravel is simply cleared from the outline and interior of the figure, and piled at its edges in low berms that define the image and give it a slight three-dimensional quality when the low angle light of early morning or late afternoon rakes across the terrace surface. The result is an image that exists at a scale that makes no sense from ground level but achieves complete legibility from above, suggesting, to the people who first began to think seriously about the blithe figures, that they were intended to be seen from above, from a perspective that no human being in the era of their creation could have occupied. There are 6 geoglyphs in the Blythe group, arranged in 3 pairs across the terrace. The largest human figure measures roughly 50 meters from head to foot, a scale that places it among the larger geoglyphs found anywhere in the Americas. The animal figures, which most researchers interpret as depicting a mountain lion or a horse, the identification of the species is debated, are similarly large, their outlines covering areas that can only be fully comprehended from a distance or from height. The dating of the Blythe intaglios is not precisely established. The technique of desert pavement geoglyph creation does not lend itself easily to the radiometric dating methods that work well for organic materials, and the figures themselves contain no datable organic content. Estimates based on the degree of revarnishing of the exposed gravel, the rate at which desert varnish recoats cleared surfaces, and on the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region suggest ages ranging from a few hundred to possibly several thousand years, with most researchers settling on a range of roughly 450 to 2,000 years before the present as the most defensible estimate. The Mojave and Quechan peoples of the lower Colorado River region have oral traditions that connect these figures to their ceremonial and cosmological world. The large human figures are associated in some traditions with Mastamho, a creator deity of the Yuman-speaking peoples, whose mythological actions in the lower Colorado region are recorded in the extensive song cycles that are the primary form of sacred knowledge transmission in these cultures. The figures on the terrace may represent episodes from these creation narratives, rendered at a scale appropriate to the cosmic significance of the events they depict. This connection between the geoglyphs and the living oral traditions of the Colorado River peoples is important because it provides a framework for understanding the figures that goes beyond the purely visual. These were not made to be admired as art in any modern sense of that word. They were made as part of a ceremonial landscape, as physical markers of sacred geography, as the material expression of a cosmological vision in which the desert terrace above the Colorado River was understood to be a place where the human and the divine had met, and where that meeting had left a permanent mark on the earth. The practical act of creating the blithe figures, the sustained physical work of clearing the gravel across such enormous areas, was itself almost certainly a ceremonial act. Geoglyph creation in the traditions of the Colorado River peoples was not the work of individual artists, but of communities engaged in collective ritual labor, the making of the figure inseparable from the ceremony that accompanied it. The act of creation was the ceremony. The finished figure was both the product and the record of a sacred event, the trace left in the desert by the community's engagement with the divine. Trails lead to and from the geoglyph sites, worn into the desert pavement by the feet of the people who came here for ceremonial purposes across the centuries of the figure's active use. These trails are themselves a form of evidence. They tell us that the figures were visited repeatedly, that they were destinations in a ceremonial geography of the lower Colorado that connected multiple sacred sites across the desert landscape. The Blythe intaglios were brought to wide public attention in 1932 when a pilot flying over the Colorado desert noticed the figures from the air and reported what he had seen, becoming, in a sense, the first person in the modern era to see these figures as they were apparently intended to be seen. From above, their full forms visible only from a perspective that gives the eye the distance it needs to read the image whole. Since their discovery by the outside world, the figures have been protected by fencing and by their designation as a National Historic Landmark. Though the desert environment that created and preserved them for centuries continues its slow work of revarnishing the exposed gravel and gradually reducing the contrast between the figures and their surroundings. The desert is patient and the desert is thorough. And the figures that have survived this long have done so partly through the dryness of the climate and partly through the continued attention of the communities whose cultural heritage they represent. Come to the Blythe Terrace in the early morning when the light is coming from the east at a low angle, and the shadows in the gravel berms are long and sharp, and the figures are at their most legible from the viewing area at the edge of the site. The Colorado River is nearby, invisible from the terrace, but present in the quality of the air, the slight moderation of the desert dryness that proximity to moving water always produces. The figures lie in the gravel in the morning light, enormous, patient, waiting for whatever perspective is large enough and distant enough to see them whole. Ocmulgee Mounds. There is a place on the eastern edge of the city of Macon, in central Georgia, where the Ocmulgee River moves through its floodplain, in the slow and deliberate way of rivers that have been doing the same thing for a very long time. Their course is settled into the landscape by the accumulated weight of geological time. The bottomland here is rich and flat, the soil dark with the organic material that the river has been depositing for thousands of years, and the upland terraces above the floodplain rise in broad natural steps above the river in a way that gives the landscape a layered quality, level upon level of ground, each one a little drier and a little higher than the one below, each one offering a different relationship with the river and the sky. On those terraces, arranged across the landscape with the deliberateness of a community that understood its world in spatial and cosmological terms, there are mounds, not as many as once stood here. The expansion of the city of Macon over the past 2 centuries has claimed some of them, their earth redistributed into the fabric of roads and foundations and the general leveling that urban development imposes on landscapes that were shaped for entirely different purposes. But enough remain and are protected within the boundaries of Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park to give a clear and genuinely moving sense of what this place was and what it meant to the people who built it. The human history of Ocmulgee is extraordinarily long, longer than almost any other site in the American Southeast. The earliest evidence of human presence here dates to the Ice Age, to the period immediately following the last glacial maximum, when the first peoples of the Americas were moving through a landscape that looked very different from the one we know today, following the large animals whose extinction would mark the end of that first chapter of human life in North America. But the mounds themselves, the earthworks that give the site its most visible and most emotionally affecting character, were built during two main periods of occupation. The first was during the early Mississippian period, beginning around 900 CE, when a community of Mississippian people established a major ceremonial center on the Ocmulgee terraces and constructed the platform mounds that still define the site today. The second was the later occupation by the ancestors of the Muscogee Creek Nation, who maintained a connection to this landscape across the centuries that followed the decline of the Mississippian center, and who regard Ocmulgee as one of their most sacred ancestral places. The Great Temple Mound is the largest and most commanding of the surviving earthworks at Ocmulgee, rising to a height of around 17 meters above the surrounding terrace in a broad, flat-topped platform, whose summit once supported a large ceremonial structure. From the top of the Great Temple Mound, the landscape opens in every direction, the river below, the terraces stepping down toward it, the flat Georgia bottomland stretching away to the horizon, and the city of Macon visible in the distance, its modern skyline an incongruous presence in a view that the builders of the mound would have recognized in every other respect. The lesser temple mound and the funeral mound stand nearby, their forms clearly related to the great temple mound but smaller, their specific functions differentiated by the nature of what archaeologists have found within and around them. The funeral mound, as its name suggests, was a burial monument. Its construction involved the interment of individuals whose status and grave goods speak of a community organized around clear hierarchies of rank and access to prestige materials. Copper ornaments, shell beads, ceramic vessels of fine workmanship, These are the objects that accompanied the dead of Akmulji's elite into the earth of the mound, their presence marking the boundary between those who commanded resources in life and those who did not. The most intimate and most extraordinary feature of the Akmulji site is not a mound. It is a structure that sits low in the earth of the terrace, its exterior modest and easily overlooked, its interior one of the most affecting spaces in all of North American archaeology. This is the Earth Lodge, a council chamber reconstructed over its original floor, whose floor is the actual original surface on which the people of Okmulgee sat and deliberated and conducted the ceremonial business of their community more than 1,000 years ago. The floor of the Earth Lodge is molded clay, shaped into a series of raised platforms arranged around the circular interior of the chamber, in a pattern that clearly reflects a specific social and ceremonial organization. Certain positions for certain people, the spatial arrangement of the chamber encoding the hierarchical relationships of the community in the physical form of the place where those relationships were enacted and maintained. At the back of the chamber, opposite the entrance, there is a raised platform shaped in the form of a bird, an eagle or a raptor, its wings spread, its body forming the seat of whoever occupied the position of greatest authority in the council. To stand in the Earth Lodge and look at that bird platform and the surrounding molded clay seats is to feel something that very few archaeological sites manage to produce with such immediacy: the sense of a specific event, a specific gathering, the actual meeting of actual people in the specific room, preserved not in memory or in text, but in the physical form of the clay floor that their hands shaped and that the earth has kept for us across more than a millennium. The Muskogee Creek Nation's connection to Okmulgee is not historical in the distant sense. It is living, maintained, and deeply felt. The Muskogee regard the mounds as the home of their ancestors and the Earth Lodge as a sacred space whose preservation is a matter of cultural continuity rather than merely archaeological interest. The annual Okmulgee Indigenous Celebration, held at the site each autumn, brings together Native American communities from across the region in a gathering that connects the living present of these communities to the ancestral landscape of the mounds in a way that the purely archaeological understanding of the site cannot fully capture. The National Park Service has worked with the Muskogee Nation and other tribal partners in the interpretation and management of Okmulgee, and in 2019, Congress authorized a significant expansion of the protected area around the mounds, recognizing that the landscape of which the mounds are a part, the river, the terraces, the broader geography of meaning that the Muskogee and their ancestors inhabited, cannot be fully understood or protected by preserving the mounds alone. Come to Okmulgee in the autumn when the Georgia light is softer, and the air has lost the heavy humidity of the summer months, and the trees along the river are beginning to turn. The mounds are large and patient in that autumn light, their grass-covered surfaces catching the low sun at an angle that emphasizes their form and their scale. The river moves below. The Earth Lodge waits in the terrace with its molded clay floor and its bird platform and its 1,000-year-old silence. And on the summit of the Great Temple Mound, with the Georgia landscape spread in every direction and the sky enormous above the river bottomland, the distance between the present and the world that built these mounds feels, for a moment, very small. Small enough to step across, small enough to feel, in the particular quality of the afternoon light on the old earth of the terrace, that the people who shaped this landscape are not entirely gone from it. Aztec Ruins National Monument. There is a place in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, in the Animas River Valley where the land is broad and relatively flat, and the distant mountains frame the horizon in every direction, with the particular clarity that high desert air provides, where a name causes persistent confusion and needs to be set straight before anything else can be properly understood. Aztec Ruins. National Monument has nothing to do with the Aztec Empire of central Mexico. The Aztec people never built here, never lived here, never came within hundreds of miles of this river valley in what is now San Juan County. The name was given by 19th century American settlers who encountered the ruins and assumed, in the casual and uninformed way of that era, that any impressive ancient structure in the American Southwest must be the work of the Aztecs, the only ancient American civilization that most 19th century Americans had heard of. The actual builders were the ancestral Puebloans, the same culture that built Chaco Canyon to the south and Mesa Verde to the north, and whose architectural traditions and cosmological vision shaped the entire landscape of the ancient American Southwest in ways that we are still working to fully understand. Aztec ruins is, in fact, one of the most important sites in the Chacoan world, a great house built in the Chacoan tradition, connected to the canyon center by a road, and representing the northernmost major expression of the Chacoan cultural and architectural system. The great house at Aztec was constructed in phases beginning around 1100 CE, during the height of Chacoan influence across the San Juan Basin region. It is a massive structure, roughly 400 rooms arranged in a large E-shaped plan, its walls rising to 3 stories in some sections. Its construction from the local sandstone executed in the distinctive banded masonry style that is the architectural signature of the Chacoan tradition. Core and veneer construction, a rubble core faced on both sides with carefully selected and precisely laid facing stones, gave the walls their combination of mass and surface elegance. The veneer stones laid in patterns that alternate larger and smaller courses in a rhythm that is both structurally logical and visually refined. The great house faces south, toward the Chacoan heartland, from which its builders drew their architectural inspiration and with which they maintained connections of trade and ceremony across the distance of the road that linked Aztec to Chaco Canyon. This orientation is not incidental. It reflects the cosmological significance of directionality in ancestral Pueblo and thought, the careful alignment of major structures with the cardinal directions and with the astronomical events that mark the turning points of the sacred calendar. Walking the perimeter of the great house today, with the reconstructed walls rising to their original height in some sections and the lower courses of original masonry visible at the base, you feel the scale of the enterprise, the number of rooms, the quality and consistency of the stonework, the deliberateness of the planning that produced a structure of this complexity on this particular bend of the Animas River. This was not a building that grew organically over time through the accumulation of individual decisions. It was conceived as a whole and executed with a consistency that speaks of centralized planning and a clear architectural vision. The most remarkable space at Aztec ruins is not a room or a wall or an exterior view of the great house. It is a kiva, specifically the Great Kiva, a large circular ceremonial chamber that was excavated and reconstructed in the 1930s by the archaeologist Earl Morris, whose meticulous work produced the only fully reconstructed Great Kiva anywhere in the ancestral Puebloan world. Descending into the Great Kiva at Aztec is one of the most extraordinary experiences that any archaeological site in North America offers. The chamber is large, nearly 15 meters in diameter, and its reconstructed roof, supported by 4 massive wooden columns rising from stone disc footings on the chamber floor, creates an interior that is simultaneously intimate and monumental. The walls curve around you, the roof presses down with a comforting weight, and the central fire pit and the surrounding floor features. The foot drums, the floor vaults, the sipapu give the space a completeness and a specificity that makes it possible to imagine, with unusual vividness, the ceremonies that once animated it. The foot drums deserve particular attention. These are wooden covered pits set into the floor on either side of the central fire pit, their function revealed by their name. They were drums played by stamping, by the rhythmic foot of a dancer, or a ceremonial participant striking the wooden cover and producing a deep resonant sound that would have filled the enclosed chamber with a percussion that the earth itself seemed to be making. In a roofed space of this size and construction, the acoustic effect of those drums would have been extraordinary. felt as much in the body as heard with the ear, the sound filling the chamber, and the chamber holding the sound in the way that carefully designed spaces hold and amplify the sounds made within them. Aztec ruins was not a Chacoan site alone. After a period of reduced activity in the mid 12th century, when Chacoan influence across the region waned following the abandonment of Chaco Canyon itself, the great house was reoccupied by a new population, bringing with them a different ceramic tradition and different architectural practices associated with the Mesa Verde cultural sphere to the north. This second occupation, which began around 1225 CE, saw the great house modified and adapted to the needs and the aesthetic preferences of its new inhabitants. Rooms reorganized, doorways altered, new structures added in the Chacoan walls modified according to Mesa Verdean sensibilities. The layering of these two great ancestral Puebloan traditions within a single site makes Aztec ruins a place of unusual complexity, a site where the two dominant cultural streams of the ancient Southwest met and mingled in the physical fabric of the same buildings, each generation of occupants leaving their mark in the masonry and the ceramics and the spatial organization of the great house. The Animas River was the reason for the location. A reliable water in the high desert is always the determining factor in the location of large settlements, and the Animas provided the agricultural foundation that a community of this size required. Fields along the river bottom, irrigation from the river's flow, the dependable moisture that the sandy river terrace soils retain even in dry years. The river's still there, still running along the edge of the monument, its sound audible from within the great house on quiet days, a continuity of presence that connects the site to the natural condition that made it possible. Come to Aztec ruins in the morning when the light is coming from the east and the sandstone walls of the great house are catching it at the angle that brings out the texture of the masonry. The careful alternation of large and small facing stones, the slight variations in color between individual blocks, the accumulated precision of hands that understood this material and worked it with a care that 7 centuries of New Mexico weather has not entirely erased. The Great Kiva is there below ground level, its reconstructed roof rising only slightly above the surrounding earth, its interior waiting in the cool dark for whoever descends the entry ladder and stands on the ancient floor and looks up at the reconstructed roof beams and feels, in the completeness of that space, something of what it meant to gather here in ceremony and firelight 1,000 years ago in this river valley at the edge of the ancient Puebloan world. Great Circle Earthworks. There is a town in central Ohio called Newark, and if you drive through it today on your way to somewhere else, you will pass through the ordinary fabric of an American Midwestern city, strip malls and subdivisions and the infrastructure of contemporary life arranged across a landscape that gives no obvious indication of what lies beneath and around it, hidden in plain sight within the grid of streets and the spread of development that has claimed most of the original site. You have to know what you are looking for. You have to understand that the low earthen walls rising above the surrounding ground, in the city's golf course and in its fairgrounds and in the protected parcels that the state of Ohio has managed to preserve, are not landscaping features or flood control berms or the ordinary topographic accidents of Midwestern terrain. They are the remains of the largest system of geometric earthworks ever constructed in the ancient world, built by the Hopewell culture between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. The Newark earthworks once covered an area of more than 4 square miles, their massive walls enclosing geometric shapes, circles, octagons, squares, with a precision and a scale that still commands the astonishment of every researcher who has worked to understand them. The Great Circle, which is the best preserved and most completely intact of the Newark earthworks, is the element of the system most accessible to visitors today, and it is the one we turn our attention to now. The Great Circle is exactly what its name promises. A nearly perfect circle of earthen walls enclosing an area of roughly 30 acres, its walls standing 4 to 6 meters high and stretching for a circumference of approximately 1.2 kilometers. The interior of the circle is slightly lower than the surrounding ground, the earth having been removed from inside to build the walls, creating a shallow basin within the enclosure that would have made the walls appear even taller to someone standing at the center, looking outward toward the rim. There is a single entrance through the wall on the western side, connected to a parallel walled passageway that led originally to the octagon earthworks to the northwest. The other major surviving component of the Newark complex, whose extraordinary geometric precision and astronomical alignments have made it the subject of intensive scholarly attention in recent decades. The entrance passage is not a simple gap in the wall. It is an architectural feature in its own right, its parallel walls channeling the approach to the circle interior in a way that controls the experience of arrival, that narrows your perspective as you approach and then releases it suddenly as you pass through the entrance and the full interior of the circle opens around you. The interior of the Great Circle contains a smaller earthwork, a central mound known as the Eagle Mound, its form that of a bird with outstretched wings, its long axis oriented to align with the entrance passage and the geometrical center of the circle. The Eagle Mound was a burial monument, its construction involving the careful interment of individuals accompanied by the remarkable assemblage of exotic materials that characterizes Hopewell mortuary practice. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, silver from Ontario. These materials traveled hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of kilometers to reach the workshops of the Hopewell craftspeople, who transformed them into the objects that accompanied the dead into the earth of the Ohio mounds. The Hopewell culture is not a single tribe or a single language group. It is a cultural tradition, a shared set of artistic and ceremonial practices that connected communities across a vast region of eastern North America during the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, the network of exchange that distributed exotic raw materials across this region, moving obsidian from the Rockies to Ohio, copper from Lake Superior to the Gulf Coast, ideas and ceremonial forms across thousands of kilometers of a continent without roads, is one of the most remarkable cultural phenomena in the ancient world, a web of connections so extensive and so sustained that researchers have named it the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. Newark was a major node in that sphere. The earthworks here were not a local phenomenon, but a regional center, a place that drew people from across the Hopewell world for gatherings whose scale and significance we can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological evidence. The size of the enclosed areas speaks of gatherings of thousands of people. The Great Circle alone could have accommodated a very large assembly within its walls, and the full Newark complex covering its original 4 square miles of geometric earthworks would have been a ceremonial landscape of extraordinary ambition and organizational complexity. The astronomical precision encoded in the Newark earthworks is one of their most discussed and most significant features. Researchers have demonstrated that the octagon earthworks, which are connected to the Great Circle by that entrance passage, encode the 18.6-year lunar cycle, the period over which the moon's rising and setting points on the horizon complete their full range of variation, with a precision that required sustained and careful observation of the lunar cycle across many decades before a single stone or basket of earth was moved. The major axis of the octagon aligns with the most northerly moonrise, and the geometry of the enclosure as a whole encodes additional lunar alignments that make the entire structure a monument to the community's understanding of the moon's long rhythmic movement across the sky. This lunar knowledge was not abstract or academic. It was the foundation of a ceremonial calendar that governed the timing of the great gatherings at Newark, bringing communities together at the moments when the moon's behavior in the sky corresponded to the sacred events of the religious calendar. The earthworks were the physical infrastructure of that calendar, the permanent, monumental record of the astronomical knowledge that organized the community's collective ceremonial life. The Great Circle today is surrounded by the city of Newark in a way that creates a peculiar and somewhat melancholy juxtaposition. the ancient walls of the Hopewell enclosure rising above the contemporary landscape of the Ohio Midlands, their grass-covered forms large and quiet and completely out of scale, with the suburban environment that presses against them from every side. This juxtaposition is the result of the incomplete preservation of the original earthwork system. Most of the Newark complex was destroyed in the 19th and 20th centuries by agricultural and urban development, leaving the Great Circle and the Octagon as the largest surviving fragments of what was once a coherent and unified sacred landscape. The Octagon earthworks are currently the site of a golf course, a fact that has generated sustained advocacy from Native American communities and preservation organizations, who argue that a golf course is an inappropriate use of land that represents one of the great achievements of ancient American civilization, and that is sacred to the descendants of its builders. As to land, Wisconsin. There is a place in southeastern Wisconsin, on the banks of the Crawfish River, where the land is flat and fertile, and the sky above the river bottom land is wide and pale in the way of Midwestern skies in every season, where the evidence of an ancient and unlikely presence sits within a state park that most Wisconsin residents have never visited and that most Americans have never heard of. The grass here is well kept and the interpretive signs are thoughtful, and the reconstructed wooden palisade wall that encloses part of the site gives a visitor some sense of what the enclosure once looked like. But the most important things about Aztalan, the things that make it genuinely extraordinary, are not the reconstructed elements but the earthen mounds that still rise from the river terrace with enough presence to make clear that something serious happened here. Aztalan is the northernmost outpost of Mississippian culture ever found, the same cultural tradition that built Cahokia in Illinois and Moundville in Alabama, the civilization of platform mounds and ranked society, and the southeastern ceremonial complex, extended its reach here to the banks of the Crawfish River in what is now Jefferson County, Wisconsin, sometime around 1000 CE, establishing a community so far north of its heartland that its presence in this landscape still raises questions that archaeology has not fully answered. The settlement was enclosed by a substantial wooden palisade wall, a stockade of upright posts set closely together, reinforced with bastions at regular intervals that allowed defenders to observe and protect the full length of the wall, in the same principle found at Los Millares in Spain and at other fortified settlements across the ancient world. The palisade enclosed an area of roughly 20 acres, within which the community organized its residential and ceremonial life around the mounds that served as the elevated platforms for its most significant structures. 3 mounds survive at Aztalan in various states of preservation. The largest, known as the Pyramid Mound or the Main Mound, is a flat-topped platform mound in the pure Mississippian tradition. Broad at its base, stepped, its summit flat and level, designed to support a structure that elevated the activities conducted on it above the surrounding community, in the spatial language of Mississippian authority. From its summit, the enclosure is visible in its entirety: the palisade wall, the river beyond it, the flat Wisconsin landscape stretching away in every direction. The Princess Mound, smaller and conical in form, stands at the southern end of the enclosure and takes its name from an early excavation that uncovered the burial of a woman whose grave goods, a necklace of shell beads, objects of unusual quality and care, suggested a status and a significance that earned her that designation from the researchers who found her. Whether princess is the right word for what she was to her community is a question that the available evidence cannot answer, but the care with which she was buried and the objects that accompanied her speak clearly of a life that was understood by those who mourned it as worthy of exceptional commemoration. The people of Aztalan were connected to the wider Mississippian world in the ways that such outpost communities are always connected to their parent cultures, through the circulation of ceramic styles, through the maintenance of the architectural traditions that identified the community as Mississippian, rather than belonging to the late woodland cultures that surrounded it in the upper Midwest, through whatever systems of exchange and obligation and shared religious identity bound the far-flung nodes of the Mississippian network together across the distances that separated them. But Aztalan was also a community that had to negotiate its particular environment, a northern landscape with a shorter growing season, colder winters, and a surrounding population of late woodland peoples whose relationship with Mississippian newcomers ranged at different times and in different contexts, from cooperative to hostile. The Palisade Wall speaks of a community that understood itself to be in a landscape where defense was necessary, where the enclosure of the settlement was not merely a symbolic act, but a practical response to real conditions. The evidence of conflict at Aztalan is not absent from the archaeological record. The remains of the palisade show signs of burning and reconstruction, suggesting that the wall was attacked and damaged at least once during the occupation of the site. The community that rebuilt it and continued to inhabit the enclosed space on the Crawfish River was a community that had committed to this northern outpost with enough conviction to maintain it through whatever difficulties that commitment entailed. Aztalan was abandoned sometime around 1200 to 1300 CE, the occupation ending in a way that the archaeological record has not made fully clear. Whether the community was destroyed by conflict, absorbed into the surrounding late woodland population, recalled to the Mississippian heartland by political changes there, or simply dispersed when the conditions that had made the settlement viable shifted beyond the community's ability to adapt. These questions remain open, their answers held in the earth of the river terrace in a form that future research may yet be able to read more clearly. What remains is what the earth has kept: the mounds, the soil stains of the palisade posts, the ceramic evidence of a Mississippian community living in a late woodland landscape, and the quiet persistence of a state park on the banks of the Crawfish River, where the grass grows over the old terrace and the mounds rise against the Wisconsin sky in the same patient way. They have always risen, holding their ground beside the river with the same quiet stubbornness that has always been the final argument of earthen monuments against the passage of time. Kincaid Mounds, Illinois. There is a place in the far southern tip of Illinois in the region locals call Little Egypt, a nickname earned partly from the fertile bottomlands of the confluence country where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet, and partly from the town names that early settlers gave to the landscape. Cairo and Thebes and Karnak, scattered across a corner of the state that has always felt geographically and culturally distinct from the rest of Illinois. The land here is lower and wetter and warmer than the northern parts of the state, the vegetation denser, the river presence more constant, and more defining. This is bottomland country, floodplain country, a landscape shaped more by water than by anything else, on a broad terrace above the floodplain of the Ohio River, surrounded by the low wetlands and the agricultural fields that the drainage of those wetlands eventually made possible. There is a Mississippian ceremonial center that most Americans have never heard of, and that even most Illinois residents would struggle to locate on a map. Kincaid Mounds, one of the largest and most significant Mississippian sites in the entire eastern United States. A city that at its peak housed thousands of people, and whose influence extended across a wide region of the Ohio River Valley, sitting quietly in the southern Illinois landscape with none of the recognition that its scale and its significance would seem to demand. The Kincaid site was occupied by Mississippian people from roughly 1000 to 1400 CE. The same broad temporal window that contains the florescence and decline of the other great Mississippian centers we have encountered in these chapters. At its peak, sometime around 1200 CE, Kincaid was home to a population that researchers estimate at several thousand people, a substantial urban concentration for the pre-Columbian Midwest, supported by the agricultural productivity of the Ohio River bottomlands and by the community's position at the intersection of river trade routes that connected the Mississippian world from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The site contains 19 mounds, arranged across an enclosed area of roughly 500 acres, an enclosure defined not by earthen walls of the kind found at Aztalan, but by the natural boundaries of the terrace itself, the low wetlands and the river channels that surrounded the elevated ground on which the community built its ceremonial center. The The largest mound at Kincaid, Mound 1, rises to a height of roughly 10 meters and covers an area at its base that places it among the larger platform mounds of the Mississippian world. Not as large as Monk's Mound at Cahokia, but substantial enough to have supported a significant structure on its summit and to have dominated the surrounding landscape in the visual language of Mississippian political and religious authority. The arrangement of the mounds at Kincaid reflects the same cosmological spatial organization found at other Mississippian centers, platform mounds arranged around plazas, the flat summit structures of the largest mounds functioning as the elevated residences and ceremonial spaces of the community's elite, the open plazas below serving as the gathering spaces where the public ceremonial life of the community was enacted. The relationship between elevation and authority, between the summit of the mound and the floor of the plaza, was the organizing spatial principle of Mississippian urbanism, and Kincaid expresses it with the consistency and the completeness of a fully developed ceremonial center. The ceramics recovered from the Kincaid site are among its most informative artifacts. The pottery of the Mississippian tradition is both technically accomplished and stylistically distinctive, and the specific forms and decorative traditions of the Kincaid ceramics connect the site to a regional ceramic tradition centered on the lower Ohio River Valley that researchers have called the Kincaid phase. This regional tradition links Kincaid to a network of smaller Mississippian communities across the surrounding area, communities that participated in the same ceremonial and exchange systems centered on the Kincaid site, and that looked to it as the dominant political and religious center of their region. The shell-tempered pottery characteristic of Mississippian ceramic production was made at Kincaid with a skill that reflects generations of accumulated craft knowledge. Thin-walled vessels of considerable size, their surfaces smoothed and sometimes decorated with incised geometric patterns or with the imagery of the southeastern ceremonial complex, fired to a hardness that the bottomland clay of the Ohio River Valley is particularly well suited to achieve when properly prepared and fired at the right temperature. The agricultural foundation of Kincaid was the Ohio River bottomland, some of the most productive farmland in the pre-Columbian eastern United States. Its deep alluvial soil capable of supporting the intensive corn agriculture that Mississippian civilization required. The community managed this agricultural landscape with the sophistication that all large Mississippian centers developed over their centuries of occupation, crop rotation, field management, the careful selection of corn varieties suited to the specific conditions of the bottomland environment, the storage and redistribution of agricultural surplus through the elite controlled systems that were the economic backbone of Mississippian political organization. The river itself was not merely an agricultural resource, it was a highway. The Ohio River connected Kincaid to the wider Mississippian world in both directions. Upstream toward the Appalachian Highlands, where copper and mica and other prestige materials originated. Downstream toward the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast, where marine shell and other exotic materials entered the exchange networks that circulated across the Mississippian world. The community's position at this particular point on the Ohio gave it both the agricultural productivity of the bottomland and the connectivity of the river trade route. And the combination of these two advantages sustained the growth and the influence of the site across the 4 centuries of its occupation. The decline of Kincaid followed the pattern familiar from other Mississippian centers, a gradual process of population dispersal across the 14th century, the community unwinding from its ceremonial center, as the political and environmental conditions that had made such a large concentration viable shifted beyond the community's ability to maintain. By around 1400 CE, the site was no longer a major population center, the mound standing empty above the Ohio River bottomland, as the communities that had built and maintained them moved on to other places and other configurations of the social world. The mounds remain, owned partially by Southern Illinois University, which has conducted important research at the site over many decades, and partially by private landowners, Kincaid is not a fully public site, in the way that some of the other Mississippian centers we have visited are public. Access is limited, the interpretation is minimal, and the site sits in its southern Illinois landscape with a quietness that borders on anonymity, a great city of the ancient Midwest, reduced by time and by the indifference of the world that came after it to a series of grass-covered earthen rises above a river bottomland, patient and unhurried and still entirely present for those who come looking. Come to the southern tip of Illinois in the late afternoon when the Ohio River light is going gold across the bottomland, and the mounds are casting their long shadows across the terraced grass. The river's there beyond the trees, moving its enormous volume of water toward the Mississippi with the quiet power of a river that has been doing exactly this for longer than the mounds have been standing above it. And the mounds stand in that river light exactly as they have always stood, holding their ground, keeping their silence, waiting with the patience of earth for whoever comes with enough stillness to hear what they are saying. Casa Malpais. There is a place in the White Mountains of eastern Arizona, near the modern town of Springerville, where the land has been shaped by volcanic activity into a landscape of extraordinary and somewhat forbidding character. The word Malpais means badlands in Spanish, and it is a term applied across the American Southwest to the fields of rough, broken basalt that volcanic eruptions have left scattered across the high desert terrain. Rock so jagged and so irregular that it resists travel, resists agriculture, resists almost every practical use that a human community might want to make of it. The Malpais landscape is not welcoming in the way that river valleys and fertile bottomlands are welcoming. It is austere and hard-edged and demands a specific kind of attention from those who move through it. And yet, on the edge of just such a basalt flow, where the volcanic rock meets the gentler terrain of the surrounding high desert plateau, and the little Colorado River flows. Through its valley below, the Mogollon people chose to build one of the most unusual and most complex prehistoric sites in the entire American Southwest. Casa Malpais, the House of the Badlands, a pueblo, a great kiva, a series of ceremonial rooms and a catacomb of natural basalt fissures used as burial chambers, all integrated into the volcanic landscape with an ingenuity and an intimacy that makes the site unlike almost anything else in the ancient Southwest. The Mogollon culture of the American Southwest is less widely known than the ancestral Puebloans to the north, but it was a tradition of considerable sophistication and considerable duration, developing in the mountains and highlands of what is now eastern Arizona and western New Mexico from roughly 200 CE onward, and producing, across its long developmental history, some of the finest pottery in pre-Columbian North America. The Mimbers, black on white tradition in particular, with its extraordinary geometric and figurative decoration, is recognized by art historians worldwide as one of the great ceramic traditions of any culture in any era. Casa Malpais was built during the late Mogollon period, sometime around 1260 to 1400 CE, at a moment when the cultures of the Southwest were in a period of significant transition, populations moving, traditions merging. The old regional distinctions between Mogollon and ancestral, Pueblo, and cultural practices blurring as communities came into closer contact and exchanged ideas, people, and ways of doing things across the boundaries that earlier researchers had drawn between them. The site occupies a basalt escarpment, a stepped cliff of volcanic rock that rises above the surrounding terrain in a series of natural terraces, its surface broken by the joints and fissures that form as basalt cools and contracts after an eruption. The pueblo was built on these natural terraces, its walls constructed from the same basalt that forms the escarpment, the dark. Volcanic stone giving the buildings a color and a texture that makes them read as a natural extension of the cliff rather than a structure imposed upon it. The Great Kiva at Casa Malpais is one of the finest examples of this form outside of the Chakawan heartland. It is large, over 20 meters in diameter, and its construction involved the careful leveling of the basalt surface to create the flat floor that a ceremonial chamber of this kind requires. The placement of the stone pillar supports for the massive roof, and the construction of the surrounding wall that enclosed the sacred interior from the ordinary world outside. The Great Kiva was the ceremonial heart of the community, the space where the most significant rituals of the agricultural and cosmological calendar were enacted, and its scale speaks of a community large enough and organized enough to sustain the collective labor that such a structure required. The astronomical orientation of the Great Kiva has been studied carefully, and alignments have been identified that connect the structure to the solstices and equinoxes, the same solar calendar that organized the ceremonial life of ancestral Puebloan communities across the wider Southwest. At the summer solstice, sunlight enters the Great Kiva through a specific opening in the wall and illuminates a particular point on the interior floor, marking the turning of the year in the same tradition of solar architecture found at Chaco Canyon and at the passage tombs of Atlantic Europe. Different cultures arriving independently at the same understanding that the most important moments in the astronomical calendar deserve to be made visible and permanent in the fabric of the most sacred spaces. But it is the catacomb system that makes Casa Malpais truly unique in the prehistoric Southwest. Beneath and within the basalt escarpment, the natural fissures and voids in the volcanic rock were modified and used as burial chambers, the dead placed in the dark interior spaces of the basalt, their bones held in the rock itself rather than interred in the earth. These were not simple burials in a convenient natural cavity. The fissures were modified, entrances widened or shaped, interior spaces organized. The natural geometry of the volcanic rock adapted to the needs of a funerary tradition that understood the placement of the dead within the earth and the rock as a significant and deliberate act. The bodies of the dead at Casa Malpais were accompanied by the objects that Mogollon funerary practice deemed appropriate: ceramic vessels, shell ornaments, stone tools, the material expression of a life and a status. The dark interior of the basalt fissures would have been an extraordinary environment for these burials: cool, dry, completely enclosed, the rock pressing close on every side, and the volcanic stone holding the dead with a permanence that conventional earth burial could not quite match. The spatial relationship between the living community on the terraces above and the dead in the fissures below is one of the most striking features of Casa Malpais. The pueblo and the catacomb occupy the same escarpment. The living built their homes and their great kiva on the upper terraces of the same volcanic formation in whose depths they placed their dead. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead at Casa Malpais was measured not in distance but in vertical elevation, a few meters of basalt separating the hearths and the grinding stones and the daily life of the community from the still, dark chambers where the dead were held. The site was abandoned sometime around 1400 CE as part of the broader pattern of population movement that characterized the late prehistoric Southwest. Communities consolidating, moving to new locations, reorganizing the social and political landscape of the region in response to environmental and demographic pressures whose specific causes are still debated. The people of Casa Malpais did not vanish. Their descendants are among the modern Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley and the Zuni and Hopi communities of the Colorado Plateau. Communities whose oral traditions carry the memory of ancestral migrations and ancestral places in forms that connect the living present to the ancient sites of the Southwest in ways that the purely archaeological record cannot fully capture. The basalt escarpment of Casa Malpais still rises above the little Colorado River Valley in the same austere and somewhat forbidding way it always has. The dark volcanic stone of the Pueblo walls is the same dark volcanic stone of the cliff from which it was built. The great kiva is there in the terrace, its circular form still legible in the basalt surface of the escarpment. And below, in the dark fissures of the volcanic rock, the catacomb holds its silence in the way that deep rock always holds silence, absolutely and without apology, and for as long as the stone itself endures. Edge of the Cedars, Pueblo. There is a high desert plateau in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest. in the southeastern corner of Utah, where the state shares its boundary with Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, in the only point in the United States where four states meet at a single location, where the landscape achieves a particular quality of openness and clarity that belongs specifically to the Colorado Plateau. The rock here is red, the deep, saturated red of iron rich sandstone that has been baking in the desert sun for millions of years, and the sky above it is the kind of blue that exists only at high elevations in dry air, a blue so intense and so consistent that it seems almost artificial, almost too much of itself. In this landscape, near the modern town of Blanding in San Juan County, Utah, there's a small but remarkably complete ancestral pueblo in sight that sits on a gentle rise above the surrounding terrain with the quiet self possession of a place that has been here long enough to be entirely comfortable with what it is. It is called Edge of the Cedars, named for its position at the transition between the lower desert scrub and the upper cedar and pinyon woodland that covers the slopes above the site, and it is, in addition to being a genuine prehistoric pueblo of considerable interest, the home of one of the finest collections of ancestral Puebloan artifacts anywhere in the American Southwest. The pueblo at Edge of the Cedars was built and occupied between roughly 825 and 1125 CE, placing its primary occupation in the Pueblo II and early Pueblo III periods of ancestral Pueblo and cultural development, the era when the Great Chakawan system was at or approaching its height to the south, and when the communities of the Four Corners region were most densely settled and most actively engaged in the regional networks of exchange and ceremony that connected the ancestral Puebloan world across enormous distances. The site consists of 6 room blocks, clusters of rooms constructed from the local sandstone in the dry stone masonry tradition that characterizes ancestral Puebloan building, arranged across the rise in a pattern that reflects both the practical logic of construction and the social organization of a community that was adding to its settlement incrementally over the centuries of its occupation. Each room block represents a phase of construction, a moment when the community decided to expand or to rebuild. The accumulated decisions of 3 centuries of habitation, visible in the varying masonry styles and room configurations of the different blocks. The rooms themselves are small and well built, their sandstone walls fitted with the precision that ancestral Puebloan masons brought to their work across the entire tradition. Stones, selected for their flat faces and their manageable size, laid in courses with a mud mortar that has survived 9 centuries of Utah desert weather with a tenacity that speaks of the quality of the local clay and the skill of the people who worked it. Original lintels of wood span doorways in some sections of the site, the dry desert air having preserved the timber across the centuries in the same way that it preserved the roof beams of the sites we have visited throughout these chapters. The Great Kiva at Edge of the Cedars is the ceremonial centerpiece of the site and one of the best preserved examples of this form in the northern San Juan region. It is semi-subterranean, partially dug into the earth of the rise, its floor below the level of the surrounding ground, its walls rising above that sunken floor to create an enclosed ceremonial space whose interior is immediately distinctive in the quality of attention it invites. The circular form, the slightly subterranean position, the carefully constructed bench that runs around the interior perimeter, all of these features are consistent across the great Kiva tradition of the ancestral Puebloan world, a shared architectural vocabulary of sacred space that connected communities from Chaco Canyon to the northern reaches of the San Juan Basin. The roof of the Great Kiva was supported by 4 large wooden posts set in stone-lined post holes visible in the Kiva floor, a structural system that required substantial timber that had to be carried to the site from woodland sources at higher elevations. The investment of labor in gathering and transporting those roof timbers, added to the investment of digging the Kiva floor below grade and constructing its walls, speaks of a community that regarded the Great Kiva as worth a very significant collective effort, worth the kind of sustained, organized labor that only a shared understanding of the space's importance could motivate. The museum at Edge of the Cedars State Park Museum, which occupies a modern building adjacent to the Pueblo ruins, houses a collection of ancestral Puebloan material that is extraordinary in both its breadth and its quality, ceramic vessels from across the Four Corners region, lithic tools and debitage from the workshops of ancestral Puebloan stone workers, shell and turquoise ornaments that speak of the long-distance exchange networks of the Chacuan world, textile fragments preserved by the desert dryness. The collection represents the accumulated material culture of a civilization across its full geographic range, assembled in a single place where it can be studied and understood in relationship. The ceramics are the heart of the collection. The ancestral Puebloan ceramic tradition of the Pueblo 2 and 3 periods produced some of the finest prehistoric pottery in North America. Thin-walled, carefully tempered, fired at controlled temperatures to achieve the distinctive gray and white body of the most characteristic forms. Its surfaces decorated with the black geometric designs of the black on white tradition that reached its most refined expression in the communities of the Four Corners region during exactly the period when Edge of the Cedars was occupied. Looking at these vessels in the museum cases, the corrugated cooking pots with their textured surfaces, the elegant black on white serving bowls with their interlocking geometric designs, the effigy vessels whose forms suggest both artistic playfulness and ceremonial seriousness. You feel the same thing that good craft always produces across any distance of time or culture: the recognition of a mind and a hand working together at the edge of their capacity, making something that they cared about deeply and that rewards the attention of anyone willing to give it. Edge of the Cedars sits within a landscape that was, during its period of occupation, far more densely settled than it is today. The San Juan Basin and the Four Corners region in the Pueblo II period contained hundreds of communities ranging from single-family farmsteads to large villages, all of them participating to varying degrees in the Chacuan system of roads and great houses and shared ceramic and architectural traditions. Edge of the Cedars was a modest node in this system, not a great house, not a major ceremonial center, but a real community of real people living in a specific place and maintaining their specific relationships with the wider world of the ancient Southwest. The site was abandoned around 1125 CE, somewhat earlier than many other sites in the region. The population moving on in the pattern of gradual consolidation and migration that characterized ancestral Pueblo and settlement history across the centuries. The Pueblo was left standing, its rooms slowly filling with the wind-blown sediment of the Utah desert, its kiva falling quiet, the cedar woodland advancing and retreating around its walls across the 9 centuries that separated its abandonment from the archaeological investigations that eventually revealed its full extent. Come here in the late afternoon when the Utah desert light is warm and raking, and the sandstone walls of the Pueblo are glowing in their particular shade of red gold, and the great kiva is cool and dim below the level of the surrounding ground. The Four Corners country is enormous around the site, the Colorado Plateau spreading away in every direction toward distant canyon rims and mesa, edges, and the faint blue line of mountains on the horizon. And the Pueblo sits on its gentle rise in the middle of all that immensity, small and precise and entirely present, exactly where the people who built it decided 900 years ago that it ought to be.